I had to come to you tonight to tell you something really interesting that showed up on Israel 365 News. And I wanted to report on this because I previously did video about the Laudato Si, and then there was a video prior to that one about Vigano in particular. And their viewpoint about this is really stunning because this is written in a Jewish newspaper. And let me just read you the title here is Catholic Archbishop Accuses Pope of Complicity in Globalist Population Control Plot. Wow, what a title. And this is by David Sidman, written 14 hours ago. And just listen to this. You will not believe how they're describing the Pope and this plan. A maverick Catholic archbishop who used to serve as the Church's apostolic nuncio to the United States accused Pope Francis of complicity in the, quote, Great Reset agenda that's being fueled by the COVID crisis. Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano is well known for exposing Vatican officials of covering up for convicted pedophile Cardinal Theodore McCarrick and whistleblowing financial corruption inside the Vatican. Vigano leveled the bold accusations among his more scathing criticisms of Pope Francis in a recent interview with Robert Moynihan of Inside the Vatican magazine. During the interview, Vigano accused Pope Francis's Vatican of being a key player in a plot of global elites like Klaus Schwab to deny average citizens of their private property and rights, centralizing power with powerful corporations and governments. Listen carefully to the next line. The Bergoglian Sanhedrin is clearly integral to the plan of the Great Reset. On the one hand, because it is pursuing ends that have nothing to do with the purpose of the Catholic Church, and on the other, because it hopes that its complicity can bring it some sort of political and economic advantage in view of the new order. Vigano also said that globalist elites are pushing a neo-Malthusian agenda that involves population control. He then warned of a union between the deep state and a deep church, accusing the pontiff of attacking traditional Catholicism via a mandate restricting the celebration of the Tridentine Mass, a liturgy long beloved by their traditional Catholics. Vigano even accused Pope Francis of the removal of an obstacle to what he predicts would result in the reign of the Antichrist. I'm going to read that line for you again. Vigano even accused Pope Francis of the removal of an obstacle to what he predicts would result in the reign of the Antichrist. It is not possible to believe that Bergoglio does not clearly understand the consequences deriving from his decision, or that he does not realize that depriving the Church of the Apostolic Mass is an assist to the enemies of Christ and to the demon himself. Wow. Then they have an interview where they have the Vigano tapes of Dr. Robert Moynihan's interview with Archbishop Vigano. And you can download the full transcript, and you can view this additional content on Rumble or YouTube. And it says, "Hello, I'm Robert Moynihan. I am an American journalist. I have been covering the Vatican for 30 years, the pontificate of John Paul II, his contest with the Soviet Union, his battle over the culture, the election of Pope Benedict, his pontificate, and then the election of Pope Francis. And these last 8 years, I have many different contacts, friends in the church, and among them is Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano. I came to know him many years ago, but in the past 3 years, this archbishop, an Italian archbishop, who is now 80 years old, has become perhaps the single most controversial figure in the Roman Catholic Church. For that reason, I find it imperative to understand how this high-ranking church official could have become such a profound critic of not only corruption in the church, but also of doctrinal confusion, the entire pontificate of Pope Francis, and finally in recent months a criticism also of the secular developments, the virus, the vaccines, the global plan for a single global community, and he has reached beyond his traditional area of expertise to become one of the voices in the world today who is most compelling, most controversial, and most interesting on understanding where we are right now in 2021 after a year and a half of the virus and after many decades of modernity have changed not only the Catholic Church but also the Protestant churches, also Judaism, also Islam. So we have a wide-ranging interview now with this very controversial, very interesting Italian Archbishop, Carlo Maria Vigano. Question number 1, Archbishop Vigano. Very nice to see you again and very pleased that you're willing to answer our questions. The great question has 2 parts. It's the world and it's the church. We are looking at a global pandemic and a global move towards a new world order. And we're also looking at the church in confusion, in division, in concern about how it reacts to this new world order, whether it's breaking with its tradition or holding fast to its tradition. And, you know, we were told to hold fast to our tradition, the tradition that the disciples of Jesus gave. And you've got comments to make and insights on both of these questions, the present pandemic and the present crisis in the Roman Catholic Church. So what do you think about the current pandemic and about the current confusion and crisis in the Catholic Church under the leadership of Pope Francis? And now he answers, it now seems clear to me that we are facing a siege on both the social and religious fronts. The so-called emergency pandemic has been utilized as a false pretext to impose the vaccination and the green pass in many nations of the world in a simultaneous and coordinated way. At the same time, on the other front, not only do the ecclesiastical authorities not condemn in the least the abuse of power by those who govern public affairs, but they support them in this wicked plan and go so far as to condemn those who do not accept being subjected to inoculation with an experimental gene serum with unknown side effects that does not impart any immunity from the virus, to say nothing of the moral implications related to the presence of genetic material derived from aborted fetuses, which for Catholics itself is more than sufficient reason to refuse it. We are at war, a war that is not openly declared, that is not fought with conventional weapons, but a war all the same, in which there are aggressors and aggressees and executors and victims, kangaroo courts and prisoners, a war in which violence is used in ostensibly legal forms in order to violate the rights of citizens as well as believers. It is an epical war that is a prelude to the end times and the great apostasy spoken of in the sacred scripture. In question 2, Archbishop, you have spoken in very stark terms about an undeclared war, and you have spoken about grave dangers, but you've emphasized that you see a type of coordination between the globalists, as we may call them, the architects of this New World Order, and the Catholic Church with Pope Francis. How can we explain what seems to be a new alliance? Answer. The alliance is not between state and church, but between the deep state and the deep church. That is, the degenerate components present within each. The state has as its end the bonum commune with respect to both the natural law as well as the divine and positive law. The church has as her end the salus animarum, with respect to the unchanging teaching of Christ. It is obvious that rulers are not pursuing the common good when they expose a population to experimentation without scientific basis, even in the face of evidence of the vaccine's ineffectiveness and the damage it causes to those who have received it, including my former boss who died within a month and had all the symptoms that are being reported from Israel from a new group that's formed to tell the stories of those who've been affected by it adversely. And it is equally obvious that the ecclesiastical hierarchy, insofar as it lends itself to supporting this massacre planned on a global level, is an accomplice to a crime against humanity and even more, to very grave sin against God. The Bergoglian Sanhedrin is clearly integral to the plan of the Great Reset on the one hand, because it is pursuing ends that have nothing to do with the purpose of the Catholic Church, and on the other because it hopes that its complicity can bring it some sort of political and economic advantage in view of the new order. This criminal complicity is there for all to see and is further proven by Bergoglio's obsessive vaccination campaign, which by means of moral blackmail wants to impose inoculation with an experimental genetic serum on everybody. In recent days, he has gone as far as to involve cardinals and bishops from both North and South America in this shameful propaganda, including Archbishop Gomez of Los Angeles, the President of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. They too bear responsibility for a grave crime against humanity. Such a scandalous subservience of prelates to the infernal globalist agenda has been surpassed only by the recent heretical rants of Bergoglio himself. Question 3. You're telling us that the church has made a shameful alliance with people whose goal are not the same as the traditional Christian goals. What price, in your view, is the church paying for making this choice? Why is it making this choice? And then the answer is from Vegano: the enslavement of the Holy See and all of its peripheral entities to the pandemic narration is the pretium sanguinis of scandalous betrayal, which sees the ecclesiastical hierarchy, with some exceptions, completely integral to the globalist plan of the elite, and not only on the health issue, but also and above all on what concerns the Great Reset and the entire ideological structure on which it is based. In order to do this, the hierarchy has had to apostatize doctrine. In other words, deny Christ and dishonor his church. The Malthusian ecologism, Irenicist ecumenism, that is a prelude to the constitution of the universal religion, the fourth revolution theorized by Klaus Schwab and the families of the international finance, find in Bergoglio not a neutral spectator, which would itself already be an unheard of thing, but actually a zealous cooperator who abuses his own moral authority in order to support ad extra outside the church the project of the dissolution of traditional society, while ad intra within the church he pursues the project of the demolition of the church in order to replace her with a philanthropic organization of Masonic inspiration. And it is scandalous as well as a source of great sorrow to see that in the face of this ruthless and cruel massacre, the majority of bishops are silent, or rather they align themselves obediently out of fear, self-interest, or ideological blindness. On the other hand, today's hierarchy comes from the Conciliar school and has been formed and chosen in view of this evolution. In addition to the episcopate, all of the religious orders, universities, and Catholic institutions have been occupied since the council by fifth columns that have formed generations of clergy, politicians and intellectuals, entrepreneurs, bankers, professors, and journalists, indoctrinating them into progressive ideology. And just as the left has done in the political and cultural sphere, so within the church, the innovators have ostracized any voice of dissent, driven out those who are not aligned, and expelled those who resist. The persecution that we are witnessing today is no different from that of decades past, but now it has been extended to the masses, while previously it focused on individuals and the ruling class. This applies to both the civil and ecclesiastical world, confirming the pactum sceleris, criminal conspiracy between the deep state and the deep church. It seems to me that in this conspiracy the role of the Jesuit has been decisive, and it is no coincidence that for the first time in history a religious of the Society of Jesus is seated on the throne of Peter in violation of the rule established by Saint Ignatius of Loyola. Question number 4. In your opinion, how does the recent papal decree, Traditionis Custodes, the guardians of tradition, fit into what is happening on the global level? In other words, Pope Francis on the 16th of July issued a startling, unexpected decree canceling the 1,000-year-old old liturgy of the Church, saying we must now have only one liturgy, the one that was written and introduced in the 1960s. Many Catholics were heartbroken because they have a deep connection with the old liturgy. You believe that there's a connection between this decision of Pope Francis and the preparation of the Church to ally itself to this new global order in the Great Reset. Can you explain how the prayers in the Church are related to the Great Reset? Answer. The decision to abolish the traditional liturgy, which was restored to the Church by Benedict XVI in 2007, is not an isolated incident and must be contextualized in a broader perspective. Bergoglio acts on two fronts, an ideological one with which he wants to prevent any expression of dissent with respect to the failure of the new conciliar path, and also a spiritual one aimed at preventing the propagation of the objective good of the holy sacrifice of the Mass, in order to favor those who see in that Mass a terrible obstacle to the establishment of the new order, Novus Ordo Secularum, that is, the reign of the Antichrist. It is not possible to believe that Bergoglio does not clearly understand the consequences deriving from his decision, or that he does not realize that depriving the Church of the Apostolic Mass is an assist to the enemies of Christ and to the demon himself. It is as if a commander of a division in the height of battle would order his soldiers to fight against tanks using slingshots, laying down the most effective weapons that would enable victory over the adversary. I am convinced that the faithful, numerous priests, and some bishops are beginning to understand that the question of the traditional Mass is not merely a simple difference of opinion on liturgical matters, and for this reason they wonder how it can be possible that Bergoglio shows so much fury against a sacrosanct rite that is over 1,000 years old, unless he sees it a threat to the realization of the globalist plan that he supports. By the grace of God, the fate of the Church is not in the hand of the Argentine, over whose remains the Vatican vultures are already hovering. Question number 5. Archbishop Vigano, are you telling us that the decision to change the liturgy and to abolish the old liturgy does have something to do with this general crisis in the New World Order? What should be the reaction of people in the church to what is happening, as the church seems increasingly to be accommodating itself to a plan organized by people outside the church? Answer. We find ourselves trapped in an impasse, a dead end from which we cannot escape, as long as we do not recognize it for what it is. If we think that the present crisis can be solved by addressing ourselves to the civil or religious authority, as if we were in conditions of relative normality, we continue to not understand that the responsibility for this crisis lays precisely in a betrayal carried out by those who hold authority. We cannot ask for justice for a wrong we have suffered if the judge who ought to condemn those who infringe on our rights is their accomplice. We cannot turn to politicians expecting them to revoke the violation of our fundamental freedoms if they are the very ones voting for those violations in parliaments because they obey those who pay them or blackmail them. And we cannot ask the bishops, and even less the Holy See, to protect the rights of the faithful when bishops and the Vatican consider our request as a threat to the power they hold and to the bankrupt ideology they defend. Question number 6. You have spoken of feeling that we are at an impasse, a dead end, both in the church and in the world. You've described a type of alliance between the deep church and the deep state which you feel is not in keeping with traditional Christian teaching or with traditional desire for freedom of the free peoples of the democratic West. But you are preaching this dead end or impasse. What are you suggesting to people? Are you suggesting some type of disobedience or some type of rebellion? Answer. Catholics are naturally oriented towards order, to respect for authority and the hierarchy, because this order and authority emanate from the wisdom of God and are necessary for the government of both public affairs as well as the church. But precisely because the authority of men comes from God, Catholics, like all citizens in general, cannot accept the usurpation of authority by those who set goals opposed to the very reasons for which that authority is constituted. The Lord has placed at the head of the church the successor of the Prince of the Apostles, designating him as his vicar, so that he may pasture the sheep that he has entrusted to him. Otherwise, he would have chosen Judas and not St. Peter. The authority of temporal rulers finds its legitimization in good government, not in making citizens into slaves and forcing them to do evil, preventing them from pursuing the proximate end of an honest life and the final end of eternal salvation. If authority fails in its duties and even betrays and subverts them, it is no longer entitled to demand the obedience of its subjects. And let me just say right here that in the Greek form of the word for the mark of the beast, charagma, which they say it's like a tattoo or it's some sort of branding type thing that marks you, and it is a badge of slavery in essence, or subjection to the beast system and to the Antichrist. He goes on to say, obedience, which is a virtue linked to justice, does not consist in an acritical submission to power, because in doing so, it degenerates into servility and complicity with those who do evil. No one can impose obedience to intrinsically evil orders or recognize authority in those who abuse it to indulge evil. Thus, those who resist an illegitimate order apparently disobey the one who gives it, but they obey God, whose power is, however, exercised by the vicarious authority against its purpose, that is, against God himself. Question number 7. Your Excellency, you have spoken of the distinction between legitimate authority and illegitimate authority, between legitimate commands that we should obey and illegitimate commands that we should not obey and resist. But how can we distinguish between them? Isn't it true that St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, spoke very clearly about the necessity for Christians to obey the constituted authorities? What do you say? St. Paul was a Roman citizen, and as such he had before him the example of a power regulated by laws that later formed the basis for the law of the Western nations, and which were also adopted by the Church. The authority that governs us today instead has canceled millennia of Greco-Roman and Christian civilization, bringing us back to the barbarism of the Assyrians, to the absence of laws and absolute principles to which even authority itself is bound to conform. Those who hold power present themselves as representatives of the people, but in fact they act against the people without any constraint, without limits either from above, since they have canceled the divine origin of the power of those who govern, not from below, since they do not allow citizens to elect their own representatives unless they are certain they can manipulate the vote to their own advantage. I would like to underline this barbarization of the law, which in my opinion is the cause of the crisis of authority, of its perversion and its brazen arrogance. These tyrants, barricaded in their palaces, guarded by armed guards, behave like Sennacherib, defying authority in themselves, in a delirium of omnipotence guaranteed to them by the availability of financial, political, and media means. I always like to call Sennacherib snack on a rib. And what leaves us disconcerting is that the masses allow themselves to be tyrannized, precisely in an era that has made revolution one of the key themes of modernity, to the point of introducing its principles right into the sacred precincts within Vatican II. For a genuinely Catholic perspective, however, chaos manifests itself both in rebellion against the good authority and in servile obedience to evil authority, in a subversion that we have today right before our eyes that leaves us incredulous in its anachronistic arrogance. Question number 8. So what you're really saying is that there could be two types of chaos. One is a type of servile submission to illegitimate commands, and the other would be a type of renegade disobedience to legitimate commands. How does one distinguish between these two things? And when we distinguish between the two, what can we do to resist the abuses? Answer: in the civil sphere, there is a need to reject any cooperation with the current pandemic narrative and with the climate emergency that may soon replace it. Disregarding regulations that are illegitimate or that expose citizens to concrete risk to their health is morally lawful and, in certain circumstances, is even a duty. In no way can one jeopardize one's life and health, and that of one's children, not even in the face of the threat of retaliation. For in that case, our participation would make us guilty before God and deserving of his punishments. In no way can we accept the administration of experimental gene serums in the course of whose production children have been killed. In the 3rd month of pregnancy, their blood would fall on those who produce them as well as on those who impose them and those who receive them. In no case should it be tolerated that a pseudo-pandemic whose victims are fewer in number than the victims of the supposed vaccines becomes an alibi for imposing controls and limitations on natural freedoms and civil rights. And if the media enslaved to power and accomplices of this conspiracy censor every dissenting voice, this should persuade us that the dystopian society described by Orwell is now being realized following a precise script under a single direction: I denounced it in my appeal last year, and no one who rereads it today can accuse me of having sounded unjustified alarms. Let's not forget that since 2010, the Rockefeller Foundation has predicted 4 scenarios for these years, one of which was the pandemic lockstep. Roadmaps have been studied for all of these scenarios, and it is disturbing to see how the one relating to the pandemic has essentially turned out as expected. See scenarios for the future of technology and international development here. The thousands of fires started around the world in recent days are providing the mainstream media with the pretext to shout about the climate emergency, in the name of which they already are warning us that we will have to prepare for new lockdowns and new forms of limitation of our freedoms and our rights. But then there will be the global cyber attack or the economic crisis, which have already been studied and planned out, and whose first signs we can observe. All of these strategies have the attack on the individual as their objective, isolated and attacked in his emotionality, in his daily rhythms, in his work, and also attack the masses in an undifferentiated and anonymous way. In what better way to stop the oil and gas than to suddenly have an oil spill on the coast of California? Those who dissent, that is, those who do not accept being turned into guinea pigs and seeing the world population decimated by transforming it into a mass of chronically ill, must understand that disobedience is just as necessary as it was at the time of other dictatorships of the last century, and even more so. It is disconcerting that after having built the rhetoric of the post-World War II era on anti-Nazism, no one seems to recognize that the same discrimination that made concentration camps possible is now arising again in a more ruthless form. One wonders whether the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century did not constitute a preparatory experiment for what is happening today, starting with the State of Israel. Let me just say that term, Bergoglian Sanhedrin, and knowing that he's going to set himself up within the sea of friendship that I talked about, the Sanhedrin made that statement with the Turk, and so the Sanhedrin is setting all of this up with the Pope. And they're going to have this sea of friendship, which is the beast rising from the sea. And obviously the Holy See means seat. And the dragon gave him his seat and great power and authority. And that's what had been revealed to me before that I told you about. I'm going to put the link down below in this description box where you can go read this, the Vigano tapes transcript here. Question number 9. Your Excellency, once again you are speaking in very dramatic terms about people being used as guinea pigs, about humans becoming chronically ill due to the health measures being taken, and you are asking for us to resist what you call a type of new totalitarianism. But how could we really come to a united conclusion about the threat we face with so much inability to understand the true facts and to know really what our position truly is? What do you suggest? Answer. I believe that it is important to open people's eyes, showing them the deception we are facing. It is a deception based on false premises, artfully created and imposed in a dogmatic way to legitimize false solutions that have already been planned and implemented. He says the pandemic was intended to impose a social control that under normal conditions would have been rejected with disdain by the masses, but which, thanks to the media terrorism and the complicity of doctors, politicians, magistrates, and law enforcement agencies, could be introduced in many nations and even in the ecclesiastical institutions themselves in Santa Maria, The residence where Bergoglio lived, one cannot eat at the cafeteria without a green pass. And in many Catholic schools and universities, the vaccine is required of all staff and students. Soon they will ask us for the vaccine passport in order to travel, to enter public offices, to vote, and to go to church. I want to be very clear on this point. Without understanding the dimension of the problem, without recognizing its authors and discerning its aims, we will never be able to get out of it, because the Lord, in order to come to our aid, wants us to recognize the evil that oppresses us and understand what causes it, in order to then be able to ask Him for forgiveness and do penance. Well, you don't have to do penance. All you have to do is repent. And the cause of this hell on earth is having abandoned God, having denied Him in His temporal and spiritual lordship, having usurped the crown to give it to the enemy. When we understand that the present society, in its delirium of being able to trample on the cross of Christ, has made itself a slave of Satan, only then will we be able to invoke God's mercy and implore His intervention. Question number 10. Archbishop, you are sketching for us a dramatic confrontation between good and evil. You are speaking of God and the devil. I was wondering if you might go into a little more detail instead of these sort of overarching antagonists on a colossal scale. What can you see in our history, actual facts in recent years, and even recent centuries, which led us to this war over the fate of humanity, the identity of man, the goal of human life, and leads us to this stark contrast which you see us facing today? The answer is far too simple. First of all, as Christians, we know this epical war is waged by Satan, the enemy of mankind. Behind the workers of iniquity, there's always and only him, a murderer from the beginning. It matters little whether the cooperators of this plan are pharmaceutical companies or high-finance philanthropic organizations or Masonic sects, political factions, or corrupt media. All of them, aware of it or not, collaborate in the work of the devil. Sin, disease, and death are the unmistakable mark of his work. Sin, disease, and death, not as an evil to be healed, but as a wicked response, as the only alleged remedy to bring life and the material and spiritual health of men. Indeed, as a normality for those who no longer live in the economy of redemption, but in the slavery of Satan, who wants to make the effects of original sin irreversible and the sacrifice of Christ ineffective, to the point that the healthy have come to be considered as potential sick people, as plague spreaders, as propagators of death, and vice versa, the vaccinated, who are contagious, as the only people presumed to be healthy. To the point that the clergy themselves date to put the health of the body before the duty of administrating the sacraments and celebrating Mass. The abject cowardice of many priests and bishops during the recent lockdowns has brought to light a desolate picture of timidity instead of betrayal, and a lack of faith among the members of the clergy, which shows, if ever it were needed, the proportions of the damage caused by the consular revolution. Because this is the absurdity of what we have seen happening for a year and a half, the response to a seasonal flu has consisted in the prohibition of effective treatments and the imposition of experimental therapies with new gene technologies, which, while not curing the consequence of the virus, cause genetic modifications and side effects. Heart attacks and myocarditis, deaths of people otherwise healthy, like my former boss, or who could recover with the treatments available. And to this is added, like an infernal ritual, the use of a gene serum made with aborted fetuses, as if to renew the human sacrifices of the pagans, with a new twist of health propitiating the coming new order with the lives of innocents. And while Christian baptism cleanses the soul of sin, and makes us sons of God in its sacramental character, the satanic baptism marks those who receive it with the mark of the beast. That was a pretty powerful sentence. How Catholics are able to undergo the vaccine is a sort of satanic baptism without any scruple of conscience remains a question to which an answer must be given. Certainly decades of systematic cancellation of faith and morals in the faithful in the name of a dialogue with the world and with modernity have allowed souls to lose all supernatural reference, allowing themselves to be dulled by a formless sentimentality that has nothing Catholic about it. The castration of souls took place at the moment in which the Christian combat against the world, the flesh and the devil, was perverted into an indecorous retreat, indeed into a cowardly desertion. Once soldiers of Christ, many now find themselves to be effeminate courtiers of the adversary. So if you want to read that whole thing, I'll put it in the description box and the link, and also the article from Israel 365 News. And this was the same Vigano that I talked about before. And I just think that that terminology is something we haven't really heard before, the Bergoglian Sanhedrin. And basically, since I've seen the blueprints of the Sanhedrin building that they're planning on building, and it's going to be on a wing of the temple, interesting terminology. It is not underground, so I just want to be clear about that. But this is what they plan to do with the Sanhedrin plans to eliminate the United Nations and have the 70 nations have a seat in Jerusalem in that building. I do believe that they're going to give the Pope a seat there, and I do believe that the Sanhedrin that met with the Turk, Adnan Oktar, who said that they were going to get the Arab countries together, and that winds up being what became the Abrahamic Accords. Then when they get all of that together, and then they come and they want to have the world court and the world system be at Jerusalem, with the Sanhedrin being the head of it all and imposing their laws, which we know what the outcome of that is. So it's all a plan, and they are all in it together. And we are now awaiting October 7th and 8th. And we know where we're going to be with our King, because we're remaining faithful to the King, and we're not following the traps of the Catholic Church and their religion, or the pagans, or anything else. We're worshiping the one true God of Israel and the Messiah of Israel, Jesus Christ, Yeshua HaMashiach of Nazareth. And so I just wanted to give you an update about Vigano and him speaking out about the Pope basically having this system of the Antichrist, and basically saying the Bergoglian Sanhedrin, meaning they're all coming together to form the one world religion. And of course, I just showed you in a video that they put the global world church in the UAE. They're having a mosque combined with a synagogue, combined with a church, with the Pope being at the head of all of that. So we are right on the cusp of everything being revealed, and I was going to not be doing this video, but this popped up today. But I had something else that was really important that speaks of the rapture and the Messiah, and that's the video I hope to do next. But anyway, I hope that you will continue to listen to my channel and subscribe to it, give it a thumbs up. Anything you can do to support it would be wonderful. So I'm hoping that the rapture resurrection is going to be happening this time. We'll have to see. Until then, keep looking up, and I'll see you soon. I have something else really amazing to share with you, but I just want to do this video first because I talked about Vegano before in my other video. The fact that the Jewish newspaper is referring to him as the Bergoglian Sanhedrin shows you where we are. And if you remember, I did that video back when I was at my garden at home at my mom's house about the copper virus project. And as soon as I posted something about that when the virus broke out, it was removed. Little by little, the beast, the Antichrist, it's all being revealed right before our eyes. So I say, it's time to go. Let's listen for the trumpet blast and the shout of the Lord, and we are going with our King, Jesus Christ. Have a very good evening. Bye.